Welcome, everyone. Welcome to our talk back today. I'm sure we'll have a very feisty conversation about Blow Up. We'll have one of Dan's spectacular visual analyses, and of course, Max and Gary and their amazing breadth of knowledge. But with no further ado, I'd like to introduce you to our president, Norma Levy. Norma. And a reminder that this is being recorded.
Hello, everyone. It's wonderful to see you here. I am Norma Levy, and I'm founder and president of New Plaza Cinema. We're a nonprofit cinema. Today, we're looking forward to a stylish, cool 1966 film created by Antonioni called Blow Up. And now I'm delighted to turn this program over to our wonderful curator, Gary Palmucci. Gary?
Thank you, Norma. Hi, everyone, again from the back room of New Plaza Cinema. Well, I believe it's just by coincidence that with this year's Cannes Film Festival now in full swing, we're focusing today on Michelangelo Antonioni's Blow Up, which was the winner in 1967 of the festival's top prize, the Palme d'Or. I was very fortunate to attend the festival a number of times over the years and occasionally to catch during some off hours a classic film screening or two, which the festival always features as a sidebar event. And back in 2004, I was present for a screening of Blow Up, along with a new short film by our Italian maestro about another artist named Michelangelo. Antonioni was by then in his early 90s and had to be very delicately escorted to the stage, but his mere appearance produced an ovation from that full house. I think he actually made another short film that same year after that, part of a three-part omnibus called Eros, along with Wong Kar-wai and Steven Soderbergh, a very unlikely trio. Now, every generation, I think, has a different response to Blow Up. In its initial release, it made waves all over the world, changed movie mores and production codes, provoked perhaps equal amounts of worship and derision, as well as satire. I remember the Mad Magazine parody called Throw Up. And when I first saw it a decade later, my own reaction was I really admired the amazing technical precision, as always with Antonioni, the mixture of passion and emotional detachment. But it felt to me kind of a mid-range achievement when I think over time we've come to see as an extraordinary movie-making career. Now, Max, this time you were successful in finding one of those often elusive original trailers, which are often very revelatory.
Yes, Gary, this is the original trailer. Just a quick backstory before we run it. The film was denied a seal of approval from the Production Code Administration. As many of us know, it was condemned by the National Catholic Office of Motion Pictures. So what MGM did is they simply removed their name from the credits and formed a separate producing entity called Premier Productions to handle the release of Blow Up. Columbia had done that, and 20th Century Fox and United Artists had done that with the so-called adult specialized film. So with this non-MGM release, I think it's safe to say that the studio was focusing on the sexiness and the sexual aspects of Antonioni's smash success of 1966. This is the original Blow Up trailer.
Sometimes reality is the strangest fantasy of all. The films of Michelangelo Antonioni speak every language. This is his first in English.
What's your name? What do they call you in bed?
Blow Up. Starring Vanessa Redgrave, David Hemmings, and Sarah Miles. Blow Up is the most critically acclaimed film of the year and winner of 2 Academy Award nominations, including Best Director. Antonioni's camera never flinches at love without meaning, murder without guilt. At the dazzle and the madness of London today, you are an eyewitness to what's happening in a world where the beautiful and the bizarre take on new forms and hold new fascinations. Blow Up is an astonishing glimpse of today, seen through Antonioni's camera, his color, his London, his first English language film.
I thought you were supposed to be in Paris.
I am.
Someone's been killed. Yeah, I was right. I want you to see the cause.
Blow Up, the Carlo Ponti production.
And then we have the critic
That's a
quotes.
very good trailer. I wonder who cut that trailer. Very, very staccato for its time.
It was, and it had followed a teaser which just had the still photos in it. There was the narrator, but it didn't have any actual footage from the movie as this one did. But no, you're right. There's a good energy to it.
I'm
And
sure it was very effective at the box office.
it was. So it opens in the latter part of 1966 to surprisingly positive reviews for the most part here in the United States, and becomes a very considerable art house success. I mean, actually crossing over to more general release audiences.
Even the very stuffy New York Times critic at that time, a gentleman named Bosley Crowther, I see he had it on his 10 best list. He was in the last year of about a 25-year run as a New York Times film critic, and was supposedly canned in 1967 for panning Bonnie and Clyde and a few other films that, you know, were taken seriously by most other critics.
He did love Blow Up. It had gotten generally good notices, and it came on the heels of a series of important films that Antonioni made, primarily in Italy. There was that bourgeois alienation trilogy with La Ventura and La Notte and L'Eclisse, which angered a lot of people. I remember that with La Ventura, you have a young woman disappearing during a vacation, and they look for her for a while and then give up and go home, and she's never mentioned again. And that infuriated a lot of people. And then L'Eclisse, I can't remember whether that was the second or third in the trilogy. You have the last 7 minutes. The film continues after the actors have ended their participation, and you just see the camera gliding through neighborhoods where the narrative had taken place. And in Blow Up, it's basically a thriller of a man who may or may not have photographed a murder, and he seems to be a little indifferent towards it, and the film sort of gets distracted from that. And that also, I think, annoyed people who were accustomed to the more conventional thriller structure. Any thoughts on that?
Well, even Andrew Saris in The Village Voice, who had a sense of humor from time to time. I remember reading his review where he said, well, I wonder what the executives of MGM are thinking. Who is this Mike Antonioni who thinks he has his finger on the pulse of the world, or young people and so forth? But at that particular moment in time, it seems that he did.
And you had told me the other day that it was your understanding that he intended it to be an Italian film, or shot in Italy.
I don't think you heard that from me. That's not.
It may have been maybe Dan Cahill told.
It was for me. It was for me. But the church in Italy would never have allowed him to shoot that in Italy. That was his statement.
And I would thank you, Dan. And I would argue that maybe 3 or 4 years later, it would have been less of a problem to do that. But this was all about knocking down taboos, and you do have an unusual structure where there's this definite leisurely Antonioni pace where you're really getting a sense of the Hemmings character. What I think has not been given adequate discussion is we associate Blow Up with this quintessential mod London movie, quintessential swinging London movie. But at the very beginning, Antonioni does show the contrasts. I mean, you do see the mimes racing around the very hip London, but you see David Hemmings' photographer character. He is been going on a photographic assignment in a working class atmosphere. I want to say a factory. And
well, there's the expression that he uses in the film called a DOS house, DOSS,
Doss House,
which apparently is like sort of what we would call a homeless shelter, I think, in NYC, and he's in there on some kind of, apparently some kind of socially responsible photo book project where he's taking pictures of these, you know, down and outers of London, while at the same time being engaged in much more licentious photography and personal gratification almost simultaneously.
right? So you do see that class consciousness in the film, and even later on where he's meeting with the man I presume is his editor of a book he's working on, which features the photographs from that DOS house, and Hemming wants to add what he hopes would be those revealing photographs of the Vanessa Redgrave park photos.
Including apparently a photo thrown in as an in-joke of the South American author Julio Cortázar, whose short story Blow Up is based on.
There you have it.
No.
But it's just the use of color, it's the use of composition, which is in contrast to what we tend to associate with more modish filmmaking of that time. And I know Dan is going to talk, I don't want to get ahead of Dan here, he's going to talk plenty about that, but there's so much to admire in where Antonioni puts his camera and how he stages the actors. Seeing an Antonioni film for the first time in English, because the previous ones, of course, were Italian, you really do get a sense of the minimalism in the dialogue. Where
I was trying to find a dialogue list for the film, and my usual source called a website called opensubtitles.org was down over the weekend, but you could go in there and pull up an English dialogue, you know, a transcription, and I bet you're not going to come up with more than 300 titles, which is very, very few for a feature film. Now, we were screening My Night at Mods this afternoon, Max and I at the theater. I bet there was 1,500 subtitles in that film. There's just so much dialogue.
Easily, and you
identical running time.
No, and there are segments of Blow Up which are purely visual, and of course the most famous being the scene where he is analyzing the photos he's just taken out of the dark room and enlarging them and just driving around the city where there is no dialogue, and the dialogue that takes place is almost incidental. I wish I had taken more notes about those sparse words that were exchanged, but when he's with Sarah Miles visits his studio towards the end, and she asks who it was who was killed, and he just responds, someone.
Mm-hmm.
It's a quintessential Antonioni line.
Well, and of course, yeah, that whole sequence very influential of when he determines what's going on with the photos by blowing them up and posting them side by side. Stolen pretty much whole hog by Francis Coppola in The Conversation, Brian De Palma in Blowout, and others. I'm sure I'm not thinking of.
This is where I go la 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 whenever I hear.
But as Francis Coppola said in an interview once, well, my father always told me, always steal from the best.
I had heard that too. And The Conversation is, in fact, I guess, an audio take on Blow Up. I mean, it even opens with a mime in a park during the opening credits, as Blow Up is ended by the mimes, Jerry Shields, if memory serves. So you do have this this influence that Blow Up had. Although the conversation does follow more of a, I don't want to say conventional, but there's definitely a straight thriller track there. Whereas Blow Up, you do have the side tracks to his work as a fashion photographer. You see the fling he has with the two models, one of whom was Jane Birkin. You see when the story is supposed to really be heating up towards the end, there's that side trip to the Yardbirds concert.
Well, I guess that had to be in there because that was part of the marketing campaign or something where we see Jeff Beck and Jimmy Page smashing their guitars and
Yes.
playing.
And I'm sure it
contributed.
And I'm sure it contributed to the great popularity of the film. But it is interesting how these were obviously deliberate narrative choices on Antonioni's part, and he would continue that. He did that before. He would continue to do it again.
Well, now I think, time has vindicated those early 60s films that you spoke about, La Ventura, Lake Cleese, The Red Desert. These are all considered masterworks now.
They're brilliant.
And I think that Blow Up is more, I think, and we'll see what people have to say and what Dan thinks, more a product of its time, certainly also, surpassingly well made, but not in the same league, I think, as those earlier films. Just kind of one of those amazing, as we're quoting everybody today, as Jean-Luc Godard said, I think he was talking about Taxi Driver in this case. He said, well, when a seriously intentioned film becomes a big popular success, it's because of a misunderstanding. And I think
Exactly.
that's the same is true, I think, here with Blow Up. It's kind of a head-scratchingly amazing that it was as successful as it was. And that's the kind of thing that keeps us all awake and alert here at the movie watching table at New Plaza Cinema.
No, it's true. And when I talked about Europe versus the censors earlier in the week for New Plaza Cinema, I had alluded to the fact that, and I wasn't others have specified this previously when writing about international cinema in the 50s and 60s, where the tremendous success that a number of specialized films had at that time, it had as much to do with the salacious nature that audiences were expecting more frank approaches to sex and adult relationships and possibly nudity in a film coming from Europe than they would from a Hollywood picture in the 1950s or 60s. And Blow Up has to also have been a part of that misunderstanding and expectation. Although in this case, it certainly delivers the goods.
It's just astounding to me. How do they get away with it? Like looking at it again this week, there's at least a couple of very discernible shots of female full frontal nudity when they're rolling around on the sticky paper or whatever. I mean, how did they get away with that? They just say, I bet there was some scissors yielded in certain conservative areas of America, probably in some of those scenes in the projection booths.
I had also talked about, you mentioned Blow Up was shown, well, I know that Variety reviewed it from the Cannes Festival. I'm sorry, you say it was the Cannes Festival in '67.
That's right, which would never happen today. The film actually opened in New York in December of 1966. There's a fascinating making of, which I'll talk about a little bit later, but you see some shots of the late lamented Baronet and Coronet Theater having the New York City premiere, and Bloomingdale's across the street when those theaters were the center of the movie going universe in New York. The film opened in December of 1966. It wasn't shown in Cannes until the following spring, and not released in Italy, probably because of censorship issues, until like the late summer of 1967, after everybody's vacation.
A year earlier, or shall I say, in May of 1966. So this was months before Blow Up opened. And I talked a little bit about this on Wednesday, but John Frankenheimer's psychological horror film Seconds opened at Cannes. That version was censored because it originally contained a grape stomping sequence that the Rock Hudson character attends,
Yes.
in which there's graphic nudity there, including full frontal female nudity. And Paramount demanded that Frankenheimer remove that footage, and it was cut in the US. I believe it was cut in the UK. It showed in certain European countries, and we didn't get to see it on DVD until the late 90s. But there was something that shifted by the end of 1966, where MGM allowed Antonioni to get away with it. I'll continue. Actually, there was a quick
Well,
reference.
we also had another watershed that year, Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf? And I think all
Yes.
these pictures were released without the, that global icon seal of approval that we become used to seeing from the Motion Picture Association of America, and hastened the creation of the rating system about 2 years later.
Exactly. And the scene that you're mentioning, Gary, with the two young women, that was the scene that caused MGM the greatest concern. And they apparently did want Antonioni to cut that scene. He refused. And that's when the studio, I mean, to its credit, rather than being bossy and demanding, they said, okay, let's just come up with a distribution label that'll confuse people. We'll call it Premiere. And we'll send it out with this technically non-Motion Picture Association related distribution company, which is how Blow Up was able to be released uncut.
Right. Now today, of course, the version that's out today, we proudly have the standard, presented by Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer at the very end, their usual credit that they have for all their films.
And in some of the versions of Blow Up that I remember even seeing on television in the early 70s when it was chopped to pieces, and in revival cinemas, there was the MGM logo at the beginning. So I guess after a few short years, they put that back on. And then because Blow Up was such a surprise success, they gave Antonioni way too much money and freedom on his next picture, which was Zabriskie Point, which was, of course, not successful.
I think was he nominated for the Oscar for Blow Up for Best Director that year? I think
I would have to check.
We'll look that up. Maybe somebody will look it up for us, as they are wont to do.
But we do have, before we get to Dan,
This is going to be a feast for Dan.
Oh, it will be a feast for Dan. But we do have David Hemmings in the lead character here, who hadn't made a lot of regarded or widely known or distributed films before Blow Up. And then after the film, he'll have a part in Camelot, he'll have a part in Tony Richardson's The Charge of the Light Brigade, Barbarella, and but it's really going to be very rare that you're going to see a film that he's in as an actor of this caliber. But you mentioned that there was another film connection for Hemmings in terms of production.
David Hemmings, his name, along with his partner John Daly, inspired the name of one of the most famous and infamous independent film companies of the 80s and beyond, Hemdale, who the producer, the ones who really gave Oliver Stone his big break with Platoon and Salvador, and a few other good pictures and some other not so good ones, and went down in a spectacular flame of bankruptcy at some point. But they were buccaneers in their own right, and left some very good work behind.
And Vanessa Redgrave had already appeared in Carol Reese's Morgan.
That's right.
By this time, and Camelot would be the following year, so she was on the ascension as well. Although her role and Sarah Miles's role, they're kind of supportive of the roles. They don't have a lot. Her character is only technically in 2 scenes.
Right, of course, one of those scenes is about 20 minutes long. It almost kind of reminded me of My Night at Maud's, which we were screening today at the theater, where there's a very daringly long scene in the middle of both of those films. But it works.
Well, I'm
She's very affecting, Vanessa Redgrave, with that outfit of hers.
Absolutely, and I'm very worried for Dan Cahill, our cinematography expert. I don't know what he's going to talk about today. There's hardly anything to talk about Blow Up's visual look. I am being ironic.
It's like a vast red desert. Nothing out there for me. But
Touché.
I found a few things here, and I'm going to
take it away, Dan.
Sharing my PowerPoint.
We will join you in a little bit.
Very good. Where to begin? I'm just going to sort of plow through the movie and note things that I think are of interest. This is probably one of the second or third scenes where he's starting his photo shoot of the Russian model Verushka, and we're introduced to her by a reflection in clear glass. This is an interesting effect, and it kind of alerts you to, oh, this guy uses his camera in very tricky ways. This photo shoot is kind of weird, if I could say so. I don't know if they're trying to photograph the model or the dress she's in. It's unclear what the purpose is, but one thing that's interesting is how intensely involved Thomas, our protagonist, is in coaching and inspiring her to pose. It's also interesting to realize that we never, ever in the course of the movie see any of these fashion shots that he has made. They are just not of interest to Antonioni, I'm sure. It's just a way of setting the scene. Incidentally, I just want to say, when this movie came out, it was cool. And that was part of its popularity. And it's still cool today. The look of this film is not 50 some years old. It looks as if it could have been made today. And here's just an example. This is Thomas in his studio contemplating where he's going to put his models in relation to this dark glass that he has set up. It looks cool. And this is what he has done. This is the result, the end frame in a tracking shot that began with the models all lined up facing away from the camera, and then it tracks over and we see how they're arranged with him photographing in the foreground. This is probably, the first or second scene where we realize he doesn't treat women very well, in particular those that he is working with. He's not a nice person through most of the film. As he's delaying his romp with the two, I could call them teeny boppers, I think that was an important term of the time, he does this little coin manipulation thing that is actually fairly easy to teach yourself. I know a bit about magic and illusions, and this is not all that challenging. Why this has a close-up shot of its own to highlight it is not exactly clear to me, unless they just want to talk about his indifference toward these young women who are seeking his attention. Now, this sequence here brings up a fascinating thing about Antonioni. He liked to film in real locations, but he also very much enjoyed altering them to suit his purposes. Now, here we see Thomas driving his Rolls-Royce convertible through some section of London. And if you note, the buildings on all of the right side are bright red, as are most of them on the left. And this continues a bit. Here we see the red in the background. Antonioni had these buildings painted to be red. Now, red is a common enough color in London. The telephone boxes are red, the double-decker buses are red, but this is kind of an odd thing to put in your movie at some extra expense, I would think. It couldn't be cheap to paint all those buildings. I did a lot of still photography in the early 70s. I hung out with photography friends. I've never seen anybody assume a position like this in shooting a shot, a still shot. It looks kind of cool. And again, the point of this movie is that it was cool then, and it's still kind of cool. Here is our protagonist leapfrogging his way up, maybe he's skipping. I don't know what you call this move, but he's moving up the rise to get to the park. And the fact that this is a mound was noted in some of the extra features on the Criterion edition of the DVD. Apparently, this mesa, this flat land at the top of the mound, has some significance in English history. Currently, well, at the time, it was a park named Marion. And if you want to look it up, it's spelled M-A-R-Y-O-N. It's near Greenwich. And apparently it looks very much the same today. And it had tribal significance going back perhaps a millennium or more for the people who were inhabiting Britain at the time. I don't know much more detail than that, but it's a place that has a feeling of presence about it. And Thomas responds by becoming a voyeur. And voyeurism is kind of a sub-theme of the film. And here he's watching the couple and hiding himself. This is an interesting moment that again tells you something about the photographer's character. He has impulsively wanted to own the propeller, and if you've just seen the film, you know they tried to fit it in the back of his rolls, and that didn't work. So he just shrugs it off, leaving this hapless antique shop owner to wrestle the propeller back into the store by herself. And he just casually drives off. Once again, he does not seem to do particularly well with women. Now, Gary mentioned the author of the story, Julio Cortázar. And this, I believe, is the photo that people say is of Cortázar. It could be. I actually have had some contact with him, and I know his photographs very well. He gave me permission to adapt a story of his for a film I made many decades ago. So I'm kind of familiar with him. I'd say this could be him, but it's a bit of a stretch. If you look up a author photo of him from one of his books, it seems a little implausible, but we can promote the myth, whatever, why not? This is an interesting scene, and I want to talk about this. This is where he's showing the photos, like the previous one that he took in the Doss house. He's showing them to his either agent or editor, I'm not sure which, but there is ongoing dialogue to the present day about, was the murder real or not? And there's evidence on both sides, but this is a sequence here, which I think explains several things and is testament to the fact that, yes, it was a murder that he photographed. So they're sitting in this restaurant looking at the photos, and the agent says to him, "Oh, someone you know?" And we get this reverse angle of someone who turns his head away just as the camera cuts to him. And he apparently had been looking through the window at them. And he turns around, and Thomas follows him out to the street and observes that he starts trying to open the trunk of his convertible, Thomas's convertible. And then failing at that, he walks around the corner and gets in his own car. Thomas walks away, and that's pretty much it. Soon after, Thomas is driving through the anti-war protest, and one of the protesters puts the "Go Away" placard in the backseat of his car, and he drives away and it falls out. Now, soon after that, we get this shot of this gray sedan turns the corner from the street where the little boy in red shorts is and turns and drives toward us. Now, it's a little bit blurry, but if you look on the passenger side, which is on the right side of our frame, there is a woman who kind of looks like Vanessa Redgrave wearing a blouse that is checked that kind of looks like her. And this could be indeed the killer who has been working in concert with her to murder the man in the park. It also explains how Redgrave's character mysteriously appears at Thomas's photo studio in the next scene or two. Clearly, they have followed him to his studio. Antonioni could never resist a chance for an interesting framing, and I'm sure he fell in love with this actual photo studio because of the beams in it, among other things, of course. And this is an iconic shot from the film. You will notice this paper backdrop is called No Seam. At least that's what I learned it to be decades ago. And the purple color is, well, this is a foreshadowing of the romp that's going to happen later. I love the composition of this shot, a semi-nude woman framed in paper that will embrace other more completely nude women shortly thereafter. Now, here we enter a phase of the film which I would describe as a procedural. And heist movies that go into detail about how the heist is performed, those are considered procedurals. A lot of police dramas where we follow the mechanics of an investigation, those are procedurals. This is basically a photography procedural. And we see him examining the negatives before he starts to print any of them. Here he is framing something for a large enlargement, which is going to be on his wall. And this is a shot of what I like to think of as his storyboard. He's panning from one wide shot to another, and I caught it right between the two frames. So here he is looking at, I think we have to call it a storyboard. That's what filmmakers would call it, where you see an array of shots. The basic language of cinema, or one of the basic languages of cinema, is to show, as in this photo, someone looking at something. Then you cut to what it is they're looking at, and then you cut back to their reaction to what they've seen. This is one of the most basic structures of any film. And he is studying this, as he will later on. Now he's got more of the photos arrayed around his dark room. And he is studying this photo, which we have seen prior, and we know that there is a face in the bushes just above his head. But I think it's interesting that they chose to have his head block what he's really looking for, because we're pretty sure we know what it is. And we see it revealed right now. And as more evidence that it was really a murder, note the presence of the silencer on the barrel of this gun, which would explain why we never heard a gunshot in the park. This is the aforementioned romp. I tried to frame this one somewhat modestly. And as Max referred earlier, the taller of the two young ladies is Jane Birkin, who had an interesting career. She's done some acting, including one in old age, which was a wonderful film. I think it's called The Lady and the TGV, or Train Grande Vitesse. It's a woman who lives by a railroad track where the fast train goes by. And she was probably in her 60s or 70s by the time that film came out a few years ago. She had a notorious career. She married a guy named Serge Gainsbourg, and they wrote a film called Je t'aime moi non plus. They wrote a song, excuse me, Je t'aime moi non plus, which was supposed to sound very erotic. Here he is, more of reshooting the photos. He needs to enlarge them even more. So he's reshooting certain portions of the photo so he can enlarge those new negatives. And this is the very grainy photo of a possible corpse that he has photographed. And I will talk in a moment or two about grain, because it is something that comes up in photography. This is a neon sign that Antonioni constructed and built right next to the park. And it provides a light source for when Thomas returns at night. You can see just beyond him, somewhat hidden by the trees, that same neon sign. I have no idea what this design represents. I've looked at it, and part of it looks a little bit like the 007 logo with the pistol, but then it doesn't really, and it's kind of facing in the wrong direction. I don't know. Another enigma from Antonioni. Here we see him finding the one last print that survived after his studio was ransacked. And I don't know why it was stuck between these two objects of furniture. One of them looks like a stove, and the other, I can't tell quite what it is, but no explanation of how it got there. Here is the Yardbirds concert, and I just want to show the recently deceased master guitarist, Jeff Beck, who is unhappy with the way his guitar is sounding, and he decides to bash it against the amp, thereby destroying it. And it's worth noting that the audience for most of this performance is virtually catatonic until the guitar gets stomped and thrown into the audience. And at that point, Thomas decides he wants it. But later on, when he gets outside, he doesn't want it anymore, which is a statement about something about this guy. And this is just some other passerby looking at the neck. He picks it up, and then he throws it aside himself. This is his daylight return, where the corpse is now gone. And I had heard that in addition to painting the buildings red on the London streets, he painted the grass in this park. Seems like sort of an anti-environmental thing to do, but I looked at this again and thought, that doesn't look like real grass. I don't know. It's another enigma. And here we have Thomas alone at the end before he vanishes, as I will with my slideshow. A couple of other things I just wanted to mention that I don't have particularly good frames for is they originally used a photographer to shoot the scenes in the park that were what Thomas was filming. And that photographer used a large format 2¼ square Hasselblad camera, which has the film in that was very fine grain. And when they did the enlargements, you couldn't see the grain. They wanted to see the images deteriorate as they got larger. So they ended up using a film that I used frequently back in the day, black and white film called Tri-X, ASA 400. And it's got plenty of grain. And that's what they used to show these enlargements degrading even further. So interesting little anecdote there.
That's fantastic, Dan. One of the
Fabulous.
shots that you showed us was when David Hemmings and we think either his agent or his manager have their backs to the camera. They're staring through the blinds at the restaurant of the man who may be spying on David Hemmings.
Right.
I have a theory about that shot.
Share it, please.
Was the camera begins tracking leftward as Hemmings is either moving around in his chair, and then suddenly the action shifts to the other side of the table where he's looking through the blinds. I have a theory that that was supposed to be a continuous camera movement because it's kind of an awkward transition for Antonioni. I think something didn't work out or something didn't go to Antonioni's wishes, and they decided to just bridge the two shots together.
It could have been that this mysterious character, possibly the killer, showed his face too much. And they needed to cut it out to keep it more mysterious. If we got a good look at the guy, it would sort of spoil a lot of the mystery and the enigmatic nature of the storytelling. So
That's a good theory. And there's something that I don't think we can overstate enough is the political relevance of a man capturing with a camera a murder, because the whole memory of the assassination of President Kennedy was still in everybody's mind with Abraham Zapruder's 8mm film.
Oh,
that
yes.
was purchased and suppressed by Time Life and doctored by the CIA and all that stuff. That having recorded a murder, certainly blow up references that.
The
perhaps
world
not
saw
directly.
those grainy enlarged images of Kennedy being murdered, and they're indelible in our minds and our memories. So it's a sad fact, but Antonioni was part of the world that knew what we were thinking. So
Exactly.
Wildly, guys, and there's a 1-hour documentary about Antonioni, which is on the Eclipse Criterion DVD. I was watching, and you can watch it on YouTube, watching it the other night. And speaking of promoting legends or myths or whatever, there's a passage in this doc where Antonioni is speaking about something which my jaw dropped. He said that he was called by President Kennedy into his office, sounded like either in 1961 or 62, and Kennedy proposed to him that he make an improvisational film about the astronauts who were then preparing to go to the moon. This was when President Kennedy had promised we were going to put a man on the moon by the end of the 60s. Can you imagine Antonioni sitting in the Oval Office with President Kennedy discussing a project like that? Now, we know that Kennedy had some unusual tastes. He saw certain, sophisticated films and was very well read. I don't know whether I can imagine him seeing La Ventura and La Notte and like this, maybe. But I've never certainly seen that story told anywhere else but by Antonioni, so we have to wonder. But
what intrigues me,
that could not go
That's
unmentioned.
fantastic, though.
what intrigues me about your anecdote is, as a filmmaker, wouldn't that make a cool scene to film? Antonioni and Kennedy sitting there talking about how to shoot astronauts who are still on Earth. Gosh, we better hurry up and get that written before.
Well, the president's log books probably still exist in the National Archives or something. And maybe now we have to dig into this a little deeper now that
Yeah, because
someone else will for us, I'm sure.
Absolutely. Dan, you mentioned a song that Jane Birkin and Serge Gainsbourg sang, Je t'aime. There's a young girl who's part of that song. That is their daughter, Charlotte Gainsbourg, and that
Right.
yes, and it's a very erotic song. It's between yeah.
I was living in Morocco at the time in the late 60s, and we heard that on the radio and thought, what is this? Of course, we were able to speak French, so we kind of understood the lyrics better than a lot of people would. But speaking of that time frame, this film came out during my junior year in college, and it sort of set a template for how a lot of us looked at the world and what we thought was cool and what wasn't cool. And decades later, this would have been in 2007. Max and I talked about this the other day. Antonioni died on July 30th of that year, on the very same day that Ingmar Bergman died. And the next day or two, I was teaching a class in directing at New York Film Academy for high school students. This was a special summer class. And I just put the whole class on pause and said, look, we got to talk about something. And I sat on the edge of the desk and I told them what life was like for film buffs in the mid-60s. That everybody went to the theater because word of mouth was out that there was a really interesting film that was challenging and provocative and intelligent. And we would talk about it later over beers and cigarettes. Some of us were still doing that. We didn't necessarily go to cafes, but all over the place, people were talking about Blow Up. And I remember the faces of these students, about half of them, their eyes were kind of glossy like the Yardbirds audience, but half of them were kind of going, hey, yeah, that's kind of cool. You could do that in college, right? So, it was almost a watershed film for my circle of friends, at least.
Because it was certainly making that shift from what exclusively would have been the art house arena into the mainstream movie-going arena. There are not many films did that. But
exactly.
That enabled the audiences to cross over.
It got distribution in mainstream cinemas. You didn't have to go to the art house place to see it. I recall. Somebody could probably prove me wrong on that. I have one other, maybe not one, but a couple of other interesting bits of research. As I was looking at this storyboard that he was setting up on his wall, it occurred to me that Hitchcock would easily have admired this film. And I just Googled Hitchcock on Blow Up. And it turns out that in 1966, he was working with a writer named Howard Fast, who wrote Spartacus and several other things. They were collaborating on a project called Kaleidoscope, which was later abandoned. But this is what I found on the internet. The first time Hitchcock saw Blow Up, he was struck dumb. My God, Hitchcock blurted to screenwriter Howard Fast, I've just seen Michelangelo Antonioni's Blow Up. These Italian directors are a century ahead of me in terms of technique. What have I been doing all this time? He would watch the film repeatedly, absorbing the same hazy color palette and rough cynicism into his work.
That's fabulous.
Yeah. These people know each other's work, okay? They're not living in bubbles.
I have another director anecdote for you. So Stanley Donen is in New York promoting his film Two for the Road with Audrey Hepburn and Albert Finney, which New Plaza showed a number of years ago at another location.
And you spoke at that screening, Max, if I remember correctly.
Yes, I did speak at the screening. And Bosley Crowther of the New York Times is interviewing Donnan after Two for the Road, and he's openly saying how much he dislikes the film and says that it's far inferior to Blow Up. And Donnan said, well, as far as I'm concerned, Mr. Crowther, Blow Up is a cross between Funny Face and Rear Window, and you, Mr. Crowther, are a very rude man. But that shows the impact, and apparently there was rousing applause in the audience, but anyhow.
Well, there are other references. If you go a little deeper into Googling Hitchcock and Blow Up, you will find a lot of people doing comparison studies between Rear Window and Blow Up, which deal with voyeuristic photography, et cetera, et cetera. So maybe Antonioni was imitating Rear Window. I'm sure he'd seen it. I'm sure he knew what it was.
But really, this is an Antonioni picture. I mean, just because it deals with voyeurism, it's easy for everyone to say, oh, it's Hitchcockian in theme, but it's an Antonioni picture through and through in the way the scenes are laid out that you so powerfully illustrated to us, the way the characters are developed or underdeveloped, what's said, what's not being said. It's certainly not the Hitchcock approach to such material.
And again, Antonioni specializes in the unresolved, the enigmatic, the unknowable things. That's what his films are like. I am not repulsed by that. I'm rather drawn in by them. There is a wonderful film called About Ellie by the Iranian filmmaker Asghar Farhadi. I don't know if you've seen it or not, but it's about
one of his early pictures.
Yeah, it's about the disappearance of a young woman at a vacation site. And, well, I'm not going to spoil the ending, but it's kind of similar to L'Avventura. I'll say that much. So it's interesting to see these crossovers between wildly different cultures and
yes,
communities.
Because some of the Iranian cinema pacing, when I think of some of the key directors of the Iranian cinema movement, there are some Antonioni elements to the pacing of some of those films. Absolutely. There was one shot, Dan, I'd love your thoughts on. It haunted me when I first saw it for years. It's towards the end when Hemming, and I can't remember, you'll have to correct me whether it's before or after his adventures in the nightclub, he sees Vanessa Redgrave's character on the sidewalk and a few people walk past her and she literally has vanished. I today still don't know how they did it. It's an amazing moment. But I remember when I saw it at a revival theater in the late 70s, there were gasps. A woman said she disappeared. And she literally, and I even the other night, I was backing it up and squinting to try to see if there was some effect. There was not. But it's a truly amazing in-camera thing.
Thought, I trust your recollection of going back and forth, but somehow my mind retains the fact that there was a cut to him looking at her before we looked back and she was gone, but not so.
She's there. A few people, just a couple of people walk past her and she is gone.
Okay.
And you don't see a skirt flying around a corner, or you don't see a trapdoor closing. I love in-camera.
Once again, it's part of what makes the film Blow Up. I mean, these moments define the film, and it was indeed before he went into the club that he saw her.
Exactly.
No, it's at that juncture in the film.
It is.
Yeah.
It is.
Okay, well, that's easy to find. Now I have to look at it.
Okay.
Well, Gary, you blew my cover, Gary, because you were talking about some of the satires of Blow Up, and I too remembered that Mad Magazine satire that came out. And believe it or not, I found it.
Oh my God.
And we're not going to be able to take a look at the whole thing, but this actually, it was the September 1967 issue of Mad, and I will share with you the first and the last image, which I think is quite clever. Of course, I hadn't seen it. Sure enough, it was called Throw Up, in which the lead-in is, years ago, the screen's great lovers were represented by leading men like Cary Grant, Clark Gable, and Guy Madison, all suave, handsome, and well-groomed. Now we have a new trend in movie lovers. In order to make out, he's got to be under 25, sloppy, irresponsible, and mainly English. First came Alfie, and now this startling movie about a way out swinging photographer. And they're spoofing the opening scene where he's photographing the Verushka character. You've almost got it. That's it. Pout a little more. Great. Click. Now give me more. Give me hate. Hate. Click. Now give me arrogance. Click. Now animal magnetism. Click. Now lust. Click. Now love, love, love. Click, click, click. Now just one more. Just give me one thing I need most. The one thing I must have. And she says, "What's that, Mr. Drac?" He says, "Film. I must have film for my camera." So and then at the very end, after they've satirized the narrative, they do something that I think is very ingenious and then pretty intellectual for the time. It's after the tennis match. You have two men. One is very informed and one is very clueless. The informed man is saying, "See that? He's running after the imaginary ball in the symbolic mock pantomime scene. He's as crazy as the rest of us." And the confused man says, "But I'm confused. Aside from the wild photography, what does the scene mean?" The first man says, "The tennis game represents the game of life. The ball is the murder and his failure to come to grips with it. The blades of grass are the women he's stepped on. The most significant are the previous sex scenes." "Well, really, and what do the previous sex scenes represent?" The first man, "About $8 million in art theater grosses for the producer." And the second man says, "How come you understand so much about this movie?" The first man, "Because I'm Carlo Ponti, the producer. How come you understand so little?" "Because I'm Michelangelo Antonioni, the director."
I did notice the resemblance of the guy on the left to Ponti. So
Yes, very good.
Is that particular article, let's call it, available online? Do you have a link to it?
It actually, there is a website, it's an archive that provides free downloads of issues from Mad Magazine.
I gotta look for it. Yeah.
Yeah, I will
Or
make sure
send us a
that you
link,
get it.
post a link somewhere. I think
I will
everybody
do
would
that.
enjoy that.
In any event, anything to add, gentlemen, before we open things up?
I don't think so.
I think that's a pretty good canvas.
Then I just want to do a reminder that in 2 weeks at the New Plaza, well, a couple of things are going on. At the end of May 31st, I am doing a presentation on the film collaboration between Marlene Dietrich and Josef von Sternberg. And then 2 weeks from today, we're going to be doing that live in the theater, but also be showing some films of von Sternberg and Dietrich. And Dan, you also
Yes.
have a presentation coming up.
Yes, on Wednesday, June 7th, it's my maiden voyage as a lecturer here at New Plaza. I'm going to be doing a presentation titled World War II on Film Without John Wayne. And if you want to see the paragraph explaining that, it went out with the publicity for promoting the lecture. And following that, we are going to do what a lot of people remember as a very favorite film, The Americanization of Emily from 1964 with James Garner and Julie Andrews. So that's our talk back the following Sunday on the 11th, I believe.
Fantastic. And I'll just give people a quick taste of Dietrich and Sternberg in this presentation that will be both online and in person at the cinema.
Ich bin die fesche Lola, der Liebling der Saison. Ich habe ein Pianola zu Haus in mein Salon. Ich bin die fesche Lola, mich liebt ein jedermann. Doch an mein Pianola, da lass ich keinen ran. Ich bin die fesche Lola, der Liebling der Saison. Ich habe ein Pianola zu Haus in mein Salon. Doch will mich wer begleiten, da unten aus dem Saal, dem hau ich in die Seiten und red ihm aufs Pedal. Lola, Lola, jeder weiß, wer ich bin. Sieht man nur nach mir hin, schon verwirrt sich der Sinn. Männer, Männer, keinen küss ich hier. Und allein am Klavier sing die Zeilen nicht mehr. Ich bin die fesche Lola, der Liebling der Saison. Ich habe ein Pianola zu Hause in meinem Salon. Ich bin die fesche Lola, mich liebt ein jedermann. Doch an mein Pianola, da lass ich keinen ran. Ich bin die fesche Lola.
We'll be singing that song in our heads for the rest of the week.
And
But-
don't forget, it took more than one man to give her the name Shanghai Lily.
Exactly.
Love that.
Thank you, gentlemen. So now let us take questions
Q&A.
and thoughts from our attendees.
I'm afraid I'm going to have to jump back into the cinema, guys, but
Okay,
this has
Gary.
been great.
Thanks, Gary.
thank you so much for joining us, Gary.
See you in a couple weeks.
See you in a couple of weeks.
See you,
Thanks.
Gary.
And Laurie
So-
Turchin is here to assist us.
Hey, if anyone has a question, please feel free to raise your hand. Someone asked where was Jimmy Page, and I said that was in the Yardbird scene where you pointed out Jeff Beck.
Yes.
As part of the Yardbirds. And then
He looks much younger than any of us remember, so that may confuse people.
And you know, before I forget, we also want to give a shout out to Herbie Hancock, who wrote the theme music.
really?
Excuse me, Max, he's
Tell me.
credited as Herbert Hancock.
Yes, sorry, Herbert
Okay.
Hancock.
Very
Herbert
formal,
Hancock.
very British.
But his score, it's very non-intrusive. We see
It
it,
is.
it's the jazzy opening during the titles, and then it creeps in a little bit during the film, but it's not intrusive at all. So
Yeah, it's a lovely score.
go ahead, Laurie, I'm sorry.
That's okay. Well, Marianne has a question. Let's call on Marianne. Marianne?
Yeah, guys, I don't understand the love scene when he comes back. The house is ransacked, and you see people making love, and I don't know who is it. What is it?
So
Yes,
when he comes,
go ahead,
if I'm
Max.
not mistaken, he comes back to his studio and sees it ransacked, and then he goes to the apartment where Sarah Miles lives, and he sees her making love to
Ah, okay. So
this man.
I thought it was Vanessa
That's-
Redgrave, and so I thought, how
No.
come?
No,
Okay.
it's Sarah Miles, who is the partner of Bill, the artist friend, whose paintings we see glimpses of early in the film. And somebody noted that when Sarah Miles sees that Hemmings is watching them, she seems to get more excited sexually. Just a little
No, I noticed
observation.
that too. Yeah.
Lots of voyeurism in this film here, folks.
Someone noted that KB, that the trailer seems to be about a different movie, that he was a photographer and the mystery of the killing seems completely ignored. What would
They
you-
don't play up the crime factor in that trailer, do they? That's a
No,
good-
no, there's no indication of violence, I don't think, at all.
It's glamour and sex and photography and sex and London and sex.
And again, it's cool. It's
And it's
cool.
cool and
And
sex.
it's still cool. That's the amazing thing.
Yeah, it's funny that there was that weird time in the late
Mm-hmm.
70s when you went to an art cinema and you saw a film from the late 60s and it seemed to come out of another universe. It seemed so weird. And I remember seeing Blow Up around 1977 and it just seemed ancient. But I didn't get that feeling today. It definitely, something has switched in the
Well,
cultural
also,
psyche.
I can speak from the vantage point of a 20-year-old watching it in 1966. We'd been hearing a lot about how cool London was, and swinging and Carnaby Street and the birds in their mini skirts and all this. And now we actually got to see some of that. We hadn't really been exposed to it, but there it was. And a lot of people probably decided to go off to London after seeing the movie. I don't know.
Well, not to make you feel bad, Dan, but I was way too young to be taken to see this movie when it came out. I
I'm
had to
sure.
wait until CBS showed it in the early 70s chopped
Ooh.
with commercials on a black and white television set. And
Oh,
I'll never forget when Hemming got back to his studio and Jane Birkin was there with her girlfriend, and the three of them go off into another room. They cut to a commercial, and when
yeah.
they came back, David was on his own, and I felt very cheated.
Someone had asked if they had to paint the location back from being red, and I said probably, but it always depends on the deal.
You know, Dan, you reminded me though, but weren't there reports that Antonioni had landscape painted for the Red Desert as well?
Yes, that's a movie I don't know very well. I think I've only seen it once, so it's hard for me to recall even, but it wouldn't surprise me. I
I
mean, this
believe
is
there
a
was
man
some
who,
painting of the environment that with
yeah,
painting of the trees, the painting of something. So
there's
it's
also
perfectly,
a lot of industrial landscape in the Red
yes.
Desert, factories with pipes and stuff. Um, Antonioni wanted control over everything, including the environment he was shooting in.
Yeah, I said, as someone who used to manage locations, odds are they probably wanted it restored to what it once was. Again, if anyone has any questions, please hit the reaction button on the bottom and raise your hand, and we'll call on you.
Otherwise, Antonioni's
There is,
output, yes.
sorry, there is a question from Adam with English asking if the main protagonist was based on David Bailey. And
Oh,
it could.
Yes, he was a very famous fashion photographer, very arrogant and controlling from what I know. And he was part of a small group of arrogant men who went around shooting women, so to speak. That's all I know, but the connection has been made. I'll just put it that way. I don't know anything more than that.
because it's interesting. He's an anti-hero. I mean, he's the hero of the film, but he's not likable. And the movie acknowledges that. I don't think the movie is pretending that he is. He's seen as a very unpleasant fellow who manipulates those around him and who's disconnected from events that are forcing him to become more involved. And
not
even
somebody you'd want to have a pint with at the pub. Okay.
No, and even in that scene, Dan, that you had showed a clip or a photo from, where he is meeting with his editor or agent to talk about this book in progress, you really don't get a sense that the Hemmings character is doing this book because he wants to show injustice or he wants to tell the world about poverty. He's doing it because this could be a big seller and make a further name for himself, and perhaps bring him respectability, and as opposed to just money that he's making in fashion photographer, or as a fashion photographer. It almost seems as though this book in progress is not sincere in its social agenda.
It's a scheme, I think.
It's a scheme.
Yeah. No, there is very little reason to even like this guy.
But he's talented.
He's a good photographer.
He's an excellent photographer.
He's good looking and well dressed.
He's good looking and well dressed.
Amazing with the BS people put up if you're good at what you do, and being good looking doesn't hurt either.
Yeah.
But it also, we could argue that the movie, I don't know if this is part of Antonioni's message, but it's the separating the artist from the individual. And here's clearly a talented man. He's not the likable character. He doesn't treat people well, but he's extremely gifted, and nice behavior and talent don't always coincide.
I don't know if you guys have ever heard of a commercial director called Joe Pytka, but he was known as a real SOB, but the ad agencies all wanted that Pytka feel, but I mean, I heard the stories are, legendary about his antics, so to speak. I'll be polite about it.
It's the end results they're looking for, and in this case, it's the
Correct.
fashion photos.
Well, it
obvi-
comes back to that scene in Barton Fink where he's sitting in the studio head's office, and Barton Fink doesn't know what the hell's going on, and he goes, everyone wants the Barton Fink feeling, and since you're Barton Fink, you can give it to us in spades.
Exactly. But anyway, it's definitely a film worth revisiting over and over again. Blow Up, and each viewing of it presents you with a totally different.
Yes, it's one of those movies which is eternally rewatchable. I mean, you don't want to do it once a week, but every 5-10 years, it demands a revisit.
And then someone wrote that the Hemmings character is devious, slightly sinister, but blasé and suave. And is it spivish? Is that it?
I don't know.
It also reminds me sort of the Michelle in Breathless, who's so blasé, and it was a continuation of that whole French New Wave and that whole ennui, if you will, of that generation.
Well, that sort of defined cool.
Right.
Okay.
Exactly.
Disconnected.
Especially for a male character. Yeah, he didn't want to show too much real sincere interest in women.
Right.
Or in anyone, it seems. I mean, there was this detachment there that was quite evident. So, well, I think that covers it, kids.
Yeah, I think we're good. Unless anyone going once, going twice.
Oh,
Thank you all for joining us.
See
Thank you,
soon
Lori
from,
and Dan.
Marlena
Okay.
Dietrich and von Sternberg.
We'll look
Thank
forward
you
to seeing
all for
everybody.
attending today, and have
bye,
a
everybody.
good rest of your Sunday. Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.